Well, now we're getting to the part of our program which I'm really excited about. But first I want to take you back to September 11th, 2001. We all remember that day. How angry we were. Some of us wanted to get even. I did. I thought, let's go after him, And that's just what our government did, And after some months went by, I started to think, well, we've never asked, why did these people do this? The government wasn't asking, they weren't interested in that. And I wrote editorials about that. And when you start asking why, then you understand why this is happening. And it's the same today. We listen to our presidential candidates, and none of them are talking about nonviolent solutions or any other solutions other than carpet bombing in the Middle East. That's what we hear from both our Democratic and Republican candidates. And it's got to change, and then in October I decided, we've had some great topics over the years at Peacestock. We've had state surveillance, we've had climate change, and they are no less important today, of course. But I thought terrorism, that's an issue we need to talk about. Nobody's talking about it, the different solutions to this. So I brought it to our Peacestock committee. What should our theme be this year? And I brought this up as an idea, and they all went with it. And we had no idea that the San Bernardino would happen. Orlando, Paris, Brussels, Ankara. We had no idea these were going to happen, but they're increasing. And even in the Tribune the other day, it said terrorism increasing worldwide. So why is that? We need to come up with different solutions. So we decided to have this program. Let's talk about terrorism, the definitions, because nobody can define it. No country wants to define it because they might find that they're terrorists. Yeah, and what's causing it? What are the solutions? We need to find solutions. So that's why we have the speakers that we have today. And I was excited when I went online. I heard about Dr. Todd Green. He was just the right person to come to Peacestock. And Dr. Todd Green, he's an associate professor at Luther College in Decorah, Iowa. He teaches European and American religious history and interfaith dialogue. He also teaches a course on Islam in Europe. And he serves on the editorial board for the journal Religions. Dr. Green also does research on Islamophobia, secularization, as well as interfaith dialogue. His most recent book is The Fear of Islam, an introduction to Islamophobia in the West. You probably maybe have seen him on major media, CNN, NPR, Al-Jazeera, and Reuters, among others. The title of his presentation today will be Islamophobia, What Are We Really Afraid Of? So please give a warm welcome to our speaker, Dr. Todd Green.
Good morning. Thank you for having me. It's an honor to be here. I've loved what I've heard so far. We needed more of this. It reminds me that, I'm not alone. Right? So special thanks for Veterans for Peace. I'm a scholar of Islamophobia, not technically a scholar of terrorism, but I hope by giving you some sort of introduction to Islamophobia today, the causes and consequences of Islamophobia, that you will have some sort of background information that will help feed your larger thinking about terrorism. I don't think they're unrelated topics. All right. And I will have some reflections on the end where I try to connect these two a bit more, but a lot of what I want to do is more of a bird's eye view of Islamophobia and that sort of thing. And usually what I'd like to do here when I give a talk like this in the beginning is to tell a story about what sort of got me into becoming not just a scholar and someone who studies Islamophobia, but someone who speaks publicly about it, because when I speak publicly about it, I don't make a lot of friends. And and so there's got to be a reason why I put myself out here to do this, because it's certainly not for my stress level. What are we in 2016? So about 6 years ago, I was invited by St. Cloud State University here in Minnesota to give a talk and to facilitate a conversation they were having on campus early that fall, so September 2016. And it was about the proposed Islamic Center in Lower Manhattan. The so-called Ground Zero Mosque. If you think back six years ago, the summer of 2010, that's all the media talked about for months. So we were inundated with media discourse about this Islamic Center and maybe potential dangers of it. Every politician weighed in on it. You can think about it. But the campus wanted to have a more, kind of measured conversation about it. So the Muslim Student Association invited me to come talk about it and to facilitate a conversation. I was glad to do it. And so I showed up the night before the talk, and I checked into my hotel, and the president of the Muslim Student Association called me and says, "Hey, Dr. Green, glad you're here. Welcome to St. Cloud. By the way, campus security called me today, and they have decided that given the sensitivity of this topic and some very real tensions in St. Cloud, if you're familiar with St. Cloud, you would know what I'm talking about, racial, ethnic, religious tensions, that they want to have extra campus police present at your talk tomorrow, just in case." And I'm like, okay, sure, better safe than sorry. That's not my job, it's your job. Great. Thank you for letting me know. So next day, I went to the auditorium, showed up about 15 minutes early, met the president of the Muslim Student Association. We engaged in this, Midwestern small talk, and then he said to me, "I hate to ask this of you, Dr. Green, but the head of campus security is now warning me, the president of the Muslim Student Association, from getting up in front of an audience to introduce you, like Bill just did for me, in case someone in the audience who comes from the town might want to retaliate." And then they have a Muslim name and face to attach that to, and you're not a Muslim and you're not from here, so can you introduce yourself? I'm like, well, that's not very hard to do. She said, "Yeah, I'd be glad to do that." But I remember in my head thinking, I'm kind of freaking out here a little bit. The thing is, in the end, it went fine. It went out without a hitch. It was a very good conversation. I remember very vividly, and very honest conversation too. But when I drove back to Decorah that evening, I remember thinking, what the hell just happened? Because you have to keep in mind that I, as Bill mentioned, I teach religious history. I'm a historian of religion by training. I'm a historian. I'm that guy at a cocktail party you don't want to really talk to, right? How interesting can he be? So I'm not the kind of guy who shows up normally and I need extra security or police or muscle or bodyguards or people packing heat, because I'm just glad that you show up, and I hope you don't fall asleep when I talk. But of course, none of that was about me. It was about the topic. It was about how difficult it is in the United States to have a calm, rational, measured conversation about Islam and about its several million practitioners here in this country and 1.6 billion practitioners globally. We were struggling to do that in 2010. I would like to come here today to tell you it's a little better today. It's not. It's worse. This past year has been far worse. We have a long way to go to where we can act more like adults. When we have a conversation about, yes, a very sensitive topic, a difficult topic. So that's why I do what I do. I want to retire one day where people who do what I do don't have to worry about having extra security present when they talk. That's just unacceptable. All right? That should not happen. So that's why I'm here. Now, before I get into sort of what's driving Islamophobia, let me just start with a definition. What is Islamophobia? Islamophobia, just a shorthand definition, it's an irrational fear, hostility, or hatred of Muslims and or of the religion Islam. It's also the exclusionary and discriminatory practices targeting Muslims, particularly Muslim minority communities in the United States and Canada and Europe. So it's both about attitudes one might have toward Muslims, but it's also actions that take place. And I will mention some of those actions, both by our United States government, by law enforcement, by even ordinary citizens later in my talk. But it's not just about people who have a negative opinion. It's when those opinions get translated into action, and that's the kind of state we find ourselves in the year 2016. So, the heart of what I want to get at is what's driving this Islamophobia. What are the main causes? There are a lot of factors, I think, that sort of feed into this mainstream of Islamophobia. I want to focus on three big ones and sort of get at those a little bit more, both the history of it and the contemporary sort of manifestations of it. So of the three factors, the first one I want to focus on is the political one. And for lack of a better word, I'm just going to call this imperialism. Imperialism, past and present, has been one of the main factors driving anxiety about Muslims. You got to keep in mind, going back, remember I'm a historian, so we're going to go back a ways, to the rise of Islam in the 7th century. Islam spreads very quickly and develops into empires. Well, there are also Christian European kingdoms on the scene at this time too. So Islamic empires and Christian European kingdoms, and then later empires, from a very early stage are in tension with one another. For all the things that empires today are in tension with one another: control, land, that sort of thing. The thing is, and the average American, I think, may not know this history, but for much of that history, Islamic empires had the upper hand. They were much more advanced culturally, they were more advanced economically, they were more advanced educationally, and they were more advanced militarily. And probably peaking in the 16th century with the Ottoman Empire. That's at least when the Ottoman Empire was at its strength. And that's when the Ottoman Empire was really encroaching upon Europe and driving a lot of anxiety in Europe in the 16th century about what they were calling the Turks, just another way of talking about Muslims. So you have this imperial battle taking place, battles plural, with Islamic empires oftentimes gaining the upper hand. That starts to change when we get into the more modern period, 18th and particularly the 19th and 20th centuries. Islamic empires, the Ottoman Empire is starting to recede, decline in its military power. And European empires, which have been around for a while, we used to be one of them, part of that empire, start to really gain in the ascendancy and focus less on this hemisphere after our independence and a lot of independence of Latin American countries, and focus much more on Asia and Africa. The 19th and 20th century, particularly the British and French empires, are going to end up occupying and controlling the vast majority of what we think of today as the Muslim world. There are only a handful of countries, Muslim majority countries, that were not at one point under European rule. Literally a handful. But any Muslim country you can think of today was probably part of an empire at some point. In the mid-20th century, that changes. After World War II, European empires start to recede. Those countries start to gain their independence, at least nominally speaking. But with the Cold War, we do have two new empires emerge. The Soviet Union and the United States. There are different kinds of empires, and we can talk later about what makes them different than British or French empires, but we call this neo-imperialism. But it is a form of global military economic hegemony, with the Soviets and the Americans duking that out. What a lot of Americans may not realize historically is that ideologically and politically, a lot of the Cold War was fought out in the Middle East. It's what historians sometimes call the Arab Cold War, with the United States and the Soviet Union investing a lot of resources in the Middle East and trying to ally themselves with various governments. Soviets tended to want to ally themselves with socialist-oriented governments, Arab socialism and nationalism. United States tended to prefer much more autocratic regimes, dictatorships, monarchies, that sort of thing. That, of course, takes place until the Soviet Union falls, and we then have one real main empire left, and that is the United States. which has not lost interest in the Middle East, by the way, and I don't think I need to tell you that. But it still does so primarily driven with imperial interest. The United States is interested in hegemony, right? We call it U.S. interest in the language of diplomacy, but it is about control and power and access to certain oil and energy resources, which actually many government officials would admit. So that's not a particularly controversial observations. Now, what ties all that together? All that history, all that imperialism. What ties, I think, all imperial projects together is the need to construct the people you are trying to conquer and control as the other, to demonize and dehumanize such people in order to galvanize popular support for the project back at home. It is hard to maintain an empire if you haven't convinced the people at home in the empire that this is necessary. The French and the British, they might talk about this as the civilizing mission to India or to Morocco or to Algeria or whatever, right? But you're having to convince people at home that we must conquer them. They need us. But in doing so, you often dehumanize them. They are lesser than, they're backwards, they're savages. They are not like us. They don't have democracy, they don't have freedom. We'll bring that to them, okay? So Muslims, in many ways, have been constructed as that other. And this is very true in modern history with the rise of European and Western empires. So we have been hostile to Muslims because we have seen them, by and large, as obstacles to our imperial ambitions. And there's truth to that. They are obstacles to our imperial ambitions, and that's some of what's driving the anxiety in our foreign policy and in our military policy as well. So imperialism is the main political factor, in my opinion, that drives Islamophobia. Okay, so that's the first factor. The second factor driving Islamophobia, past and present, for lack of a better word, would be ignorance. I know that's a harsh word, but let me put it this way. Many people in the West, in the United States, North America, Europe, harbor very strong feelings about Islam. Okay, that can be verified with data and polling. Have very negative feelings about Islam, but actually know very little about Islam. That's what ignorance means, lack of knowledge. We have strong feelings about something we don't know much about. This too has a long history. That's not new to the 21st century. It's not new to post 9/11. When Western European Christians first encountered Muslims and the rise of Islam, 7th century, 8th century, 9th century, they didn't quite know what to make of Muslims. They didn't know anything about the religion Muslims were practicing, so they chalked Muslims up and categorized them as pagans. Pagans really in the Roman Empire sense of pagans. And sometimes would even equate them with the Roman pagans of old, right, of antiquity. And that was for the first several centuries. By the time we have the Crusades starting in the late 11th century, and there's more intimate contact, if you will, between Western European Christians and Muslims, they start to understand a little bit more, just a little bit more about Islam, and recognize at the very least that Muslims and Islam speaks about and recognizes figures that Christians recognize. You know, the Quran talks about Jesus, Christians talk about Jesus. They knew that much now, right? But none of this was really informed by any detailed study of Islam or taking Islam on its own terms, and that would be a bit anachronistic to expect that. If I can fast forward to modern history, in the 19th century, it's the field of Orientalism, as it develops both in Europe and to some extent in the United States, that drove how the West understood and talked about Islam. Orientalism is a tricky word in our context today, but in the 19th century European context, it was the predecessor to what we might think of today as Middle East studies or Islamic studies. Those terms didn't exist in the 19th century. They just called it Orientalism or Orientalist studies. The study of, among other things, the Middle East. Its culture, its customs, its language, its people, its religions. The thing about the field of Orientalism in the 19th century was this. Orientalist scholars certainly knew a lot more about Islam than their medieval predecessors. So there was significant improvement about knowledge of the Middle East, for example. But we still had a problem, and it's a problem that the scholar Edward Said pointed out in a book he wrote in the late 1970s on Orientalism, where he made the case that European and American Orientalism in the 19th and first half of the 20th century had a problem. And the problem was that it was still embedded in empire, my first point. And the imperial project shaped the way Orientalist scholars were studying the Middle East. They weren't studying the Middle East just because they liked trivia or they were writing encyclopedia articles. They were studying the Middle East because they were trying to figure out how better to control the Middle East. This idea of knowledge of equals power over. The more I know about a certain people, the better I can control them. And Edward Said's point was just that European and American Orientalism maybe was an improvement in terms of some knowledge about Islam, but it was still not taking Islam in its own terms. It was trying to learn about Islam in order to conquer Muslims and control them better. So we still have a degree of ignorance that's at work even with the rise of Orientalism. This ignorance, by and large, has not disappeared today. So according to a Gallup poll from some years ago, about 5 years ago, 63% of Americans admit to having little to no knowledge of Islam. My hunch is that far more Americans have little to no knowledge of Islam. These are the ones who admit it. So about two-thirds of the country would say, okay, I confess. I don't know much about this religion. All right. According to a YouGov poll, Huffington Post poll from last year, just 1 year ago, 55% of Americans admit to having unfavorable views of Islam. Now, think about that, and we can talk about it later maybe, but you have two-thirds of Americans that admit they don't really know anything about this religion, but still a majority of Americans say that they have negative views about it. Okay, so what explains that, right? I mean, that's the dilemma here, right? The truth is, most people I encounter in the United States and in Europe, and particularly here though, have not really engaged in any significant study of Islamic text or traditions or history. Not much of this is taught in public schools. I teach in a religion department at Luther College, and we do have some courses on Islam, but most students at Luther are going to graduate not having taken one course on it, right? Very few Americans, just in terms of percentages, are going to actually sit down and really study in depth the Quran, the Hadith of the Prophet Muhammad, the history of Islam, and more broadly, the phenomena of religion and how to make sense of this tradition. Their knowledge of Islam, if they have it, comes from one of two sources. It either comes from the mainstream media, or it comes from something I call the Islamophobia industry. So we'll start with the media. The media is where most of us encounter stories and narratives and images of Islam and Muslims. But study after study after study, too many of me to cite today, find the same thing, that mainstream media coverage, more often than not, will focus on stories predominantly having to do with terrorism and violence. To the point that many Americans just make the assumption that the only story worth telling about Muslims has to do with terrorism or violence. As if all the millions of Muslims who exist in this country, that's what they're doing. They're constantly planning jihad. They don't cut their grass. They don't do their taxes. They don't fill up the cars with gas and all the mundane, boring stuff that everyone else does. That they're constantly plugged into this violent category. And it's the media that feeds that narrative, and that's problematic. We don't get much of a glimpse from the media into the lived realities and experiences and the commonalities even of 1.6 billion people or several million people here in the United States. So the media is part of the problem. The other factor I mentioned there was the Islamophobia industry, or I call it professional Islamophobia in my book. This is a network of some politicians, some religious leaders, authors, now internet bloggers who have actually made this industry big. And what they do is they make a living. And frankly, they have a career based upon spewing anti-Muslim sentiment. This is not a side job for them. This is their job. Wake up in the morning thinking, how can I demonize Muslims better today than I did yesterday? And how can I profit from that? Profit politically, profit economically. This is what I mean by an industry, not just someone who might have some prejudicial views of Muslims, but people who are trying to capitalize on that. I think of someone like Pamela Geller, who's one of the bloggers behind bringing this Ground Zero mosque controversy to public attention in 2010. If it weren't for Pamela Geller, we would have probably known little about that for at least for a long time. But Geller's entire career, at least in the past decade or so, has been on Islamophobia, and she makes quite a bit of money doing that, far more money than I do. If you want to make money on Islamophobia, this is not the side to be on. But you see, this is the problem. And the media also has increasingly focused more and more attention on the Islamophobia industry, so they get free PR. Right after 9/11, this industry was not very powerful. This is why things have gotten worse. Today, if there is Orlando, there's San Bernardino, someone from this industry will get on CNN in a way that 12 years ago would never have happened. And this is part of the problem too, right? And they benefit from this. So they perpetuate our ignorance. So, ignorance. Right, imperialism. Those are the two of the three factors that drive a lot of Islamophobia. The third and final factor I want to talk about is insufficient relationships, or if I were in a church, I might call this a lack of interfaith relationships. The truth is, there simply are not enough strong relationships in the West between Muslims who are in the minority, and frankly in the United States make up about 1% of the population, and the non-Muslim majority. But personal relationships matter. They matter ultimately. Personal relationships break down barriers. Personal relationships erode prejudices. Personal relationships introduce a human face into the equation that is often missing. So relationships really do make a difference. Yet for much of our history, whatever personal relationships that have existed between Muslims and, say, the non-Muslim majority in the West, or frankly between Muslims and non-Muslims in Muslim countries, have existed in the context of political empire and domination. Christians in Islamic empires historically were dhimmis, protected minorities, and they certainly had a degree of civil liberties given to them when it comes to practicing their religion, but they were nonetheless a dominated people. All right, flip this around. Muslims also lived as minorities in Europe throughout the Middle Ages. By the end of the Middle Ages, they were getting expelled along with the Jews, but they did exist there and lived there for a while. And then beginning in the 19th century, you have European empires coming to colonize and conquer Muslim majority countries. Again, Muslims find themselves as a colonized people. My point there is that in a context of political domination, healthy relationships don't emerge very often. And I hope that's an obvious point, right? Relationships of respect, relationships of trust, relationships of reciprocity and mutuality. Very difficult in a context of political exploitation and domination. I won't say impossible. But if you want to use a more familiar example in our country, think of slavery. Were there maybe some interesting, good relationships that might have developed between the slaveholder and slave? Maybe. But it would have been pretty rare, right? In that kind of a context, what kind of relationship do you really expect to develop when the relationship is rooted in domination and exploitation? And I promise you, this is true in Islamic empires historically and in Christian empires and Western empires. If it's an empire and we're talking about conquered, dominated people, we're not talking about healthy relationships that can emerge. Today, we know from surveys that many in the West admit to having few, if any, substantial relationships with Muslims. And this again opens up this gap for these centuries-old prejudices and hostilities to emerge. So according to a Pew survey from 2014, 62% of Americans, again almost 2/3 of Americans, say that they do not know a Muslim personally. At least they don't think they do, right? It's possible that they actually do and they just don't know that person's Muslim because they think Muslim equals Arab, for example, and Muslims are actually a very racially diverse community in the United States. The same survey indicates that there is a link between our knowledge of people of a different religious tradition than our own and our feelings and opinions about those traditions. That's what's interesting about that survey. So if I know someone who is Jewish and I am Christian, I'm much more likely to have a positive view of Judaism because of that relationship. Flip that around, I'm much less likely to be anti-Semitic. Knowing and having a relationship with someone who's Jewish will change my attitudes toward Judaism. It will change my attitudes towards Mormonism if it's a Mormon. It will change my attitudes towards Catholicism if I'm a Protestant. Okay? And it will change our attitudes towards Islam if we're talking about Muslims. So relationships really do matter. And when people ask me about combating Islamophobia, I don't have an easy answer for you, but I do think the key to moving the needle in Islamophobia is always about relationships. The bad news is that relationships, I'm not just talking about a cup of coffee. I'm talking about something that takes years to develop and takes a lot of sacrifice, a lot of time. And it's not something you will be able to do by the end of the day. Have a Muslim friend. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about deep-rooted relationships when we have a lot of work to do. So, imperialism, ignorance, insufficient relationships, those are the three main factors, not the only ones, but the main factors driving Islamophobia, in my opinion. What are the consequences of Islamophobia? Well, I've got a long list here, and I'm not going to spend a lot of time on all these points. We can talk about them later if you want to, but let me give you some examples. Hate crimes. Anti-Muslim hate crimes are 5 times more common post 9/11 than they were pre 9/11. Part of the point I'm making there is that hate crimes against Muslims have never gone back to pre-9/11 levels. They've remained at least 5 times higher. 2015, even higher than that. 2015 turned out to be a really, really bad year for Muslims in the United States and in Europe. So hate crimes. Opposition to mosque. That Ground Zero mosque controversy spurred a lot of other communities in the United States to stand in opposition to any time Muslims wanted to build a mosque in their communities. One study indicates a 345% increase in opposition to mosque in the several years after 2010. Opposition to cemeteries. I've actually been tracking this for the past year. Interesting development. Now Muslim communities that want to buy land and establish a cemetery will oftentimes encounter a lot of heated anger and opposition. In Minnesota, there's one example of that in Dakota County. The point I'm starting to make is that we're not only afraid of the living Muslims, we're now afraid of the dead Muslims. Yeah, death joke. I don't know if that's all right. Sorry. Surveillance and profiling. FBI entrapment. NYPD surveillance. Its surveillance unit was pretty intensive. The NSA. All these admitted, particularly NYPD and NSA, have admitted to their surveillance programs. Sometimes having their hand forced in doing so. But these are just examples of law enforcement engaging in massive surveillance, oftentimes profiling Muslims based on religion, which for a lot of reasons we can talk about is a horrible way to engage in counterterrorism. Registration programs. So one of our presidential candidates has proposed a registration program for Muslim citizens. It would not be the first registration program in the post 9/11 era. It's just that most non-Muslims aren't aware of that program. But that program that started in 2002, called the National Security Entry-Exit Registration System, NSEERS, overseen by the DHS up until 2011 when the program was suspended, was about registering non-immigrant Muslims who are present in the United States. So they had to register at their port of entry in most cases. Or if they were already here, they had to register in their locality. But that program was all about profiling Muslim men, particularly. It was suspended in 2011 because, in part because the program had yielded 0 terrorist convictions. Many of us would tell you that might be because profiling Muslims won't work, but I still feel like I'm talking to a wall when I say that. Anti-Islam legislation or anti-Sharia laws. I can think of 10 states that have some sort of anti-Islam legislation now in the books in recent years. The majority of states in the United States have at least considered such legislation. Hate rallies, we're talking armed biker rallies in Phoenix, Arizona, and other places. People exercising their Second Amendment rights, but in the process it seems to make it difficult for some people to exercise their First Amendment rights. I can go on. Freedom of religion, particularly in Europe, hijab bans, burqa bans, minaret bans in Europe, deportations, detentions. CIA sponsored and directed torture, and I promise you that most of the people tortured post 9/11 where our government has been involved haven't been white Midwestern Lutherans. They come from a certain religious and ethnic background. Okay, torture, which the government has admitted. That's not a controversy anymore, by the way. Our government has admitted to torture. That's just domestically, and we could go on and on about the war on terror. I don't need to tell this audience that a lot of the casualties from a long-term war aren't from bombs and bullets. It collapsed infrastructure, lack of access to health care, collapsed security. A lot of this happened in Iraq, a lot of this happened in Afghanistan as well. And if you include those casualties as well, it's clear that over 1 million people have died because of these wars. 7.5 million people at least up through 2013, 7.5 million people were either refugees or displaced persons because of these wars, right? So they might be alive, but their livelihoods have been significantly damaged. So these are just some of the casualties, the consequences. Remember, I told you Islamophobia isn't just about attitudes. Those are things that affect people's lives and sometimes, in some cases, take their lives. Finally, why in the world should we care? And particularly if you find yourself sitting here today and you're thinking, well, I'm not a Muslim, so why should I care about my neighbor, my Muslim neighbors? Let me conclude with a few observations on that. One which gets more directly to the theme of this gathering today. We should care about combating Islamophobia if we care about combating terrorism, which is not a point that's easily understood, I think, in many government circles. Those two things tend to get pitted against each other. We either have to focus on countering terrorism, countering violent extremism, or we can pay attention to the infringement on civil rights for Muslims. Many political candidates tend to pit those two against each other. But most social scientists who study terrorism and who have interviewed terrorists here in the West, or who've been in prison or captured, or who have abandoned terrorism, oftentimes find a common theme that we need to think about a little bit more with people who have been involved in terrorism. Number one, they're not particularly literate in Islam. I'm not saying religion has nothing to do with it. I don't believe that. I'm simply saying that you can find many people who participate in terrorists, or many people in Europe who might go join ISIS, who know very little about Islam. Some of you might know more about Islam than they do. Some of them have never read the Quran. They may not even get a copy of the Quran for the first time to read until they're in prison already. But these are not walking encyclopedias of Islam. They're often, I'm not saying they're dumb, I'm just saying they don't know much about this religion. And oftentimes they're attracted for other reasons to a group like ISIS, and then try to bring religion into it somehow in another way. So religion gets instrumentalized, so it's important to think about that. But is it the driving cause? A lot of social scientists would say, no, it's not. What many of these young men do tend to be driven by is anger, resentment, a sense of alienation, particularly if they come from a racial or ethnic background that might peg them as Muslim, Arab here in the United States, Bangladeshi or Pakistani if we're talking about Britain. Young Muslims from Europe and the US who are attracted to groups like ISIS suffer in many cases from a sense of double unbelonging, right? They don't feel at home in the country that their parents and grandparents may have hailed from, if they were immigrants. Nor are they made to feel at home in the country they may have been born into. Plenty of Muslims in Britain are born in Britain, but they don't feel at home there. But if they're to go back to Pakistan, where their grandparents are from, they may not be treated as being at home there either. And then a group like ISIS can come along and really pitch to that, right? You're not feeling welcome, you will be welcome here. There is a home here, there's a brotherhood here, right? This is important because if we have young men in Britain or United States who are feeling alienated, discriminated against, we are playing into the hands of ISIS. This is exactly what ISIS wants. This may sound simplistic, but if you remember nothing else from what I say today, remember this. ISIS wants Islamophobia. ISIS wants Islamophobia. They love it. They love it when you turn on your Muslim neighbors and make them feel not at home. It's exactly what they want. After San Bernardino, after Orlando, after Paris, after Brussels, it doesn't matter. They want the majority population to turn on the Muslim minority population, to discriminate against them, to be hostile toward them, to be angry toward them, to limit their civil liberties. This is when ISIS can come in and make it one of its stronger recruiting pitches. See, I told you, you will never feel at home there, but you will feel at home here. Okay? So if we're trying to combat ISIS, I mean, we have politicians thinking about military options. If you want to start with a more simple way of combating the threat of ISIS, and particularly their efforts to recruit in the West, you can start by combating Islamophobia. Nothing will harm their recruiting attempts more, I think, than starting to incorporate and welcome Muslims into our midst. Okay? So fighting Islamophobia is fighting ISIS. Don't let a politician on either side of the political aisle ever tell you differently. Second reason we should care is because human dignity is at stake. Human lives are at stake. People do die because of Islamophobia, and we shouldn't be naive about that. Doing nothing about Islamophobia or feeling that Islamophobia is not our problem if we're not Muslim, well, that's part of the problem. Because doing nothing always means doing something. Doing nothing means we have chosen sides. The side of the status quo, the side of bigotry, the side of injustice or hatred. When I think of that point, I think of several people who have been influential in my own sort of ethical formation, one of which is a Lutheran theologian, Martin Niemöller. Some of you might be familiar with. And Niemöller initially was a Lutheran minister in Germany who welcomed Hitler's rise to power. Hitler talked a lot about preserving the Christian heritage of the nation, and people forget about the sales pitch Hitler made to Christians. And a lot of them bought it. A lot of them in Germany. And Niemöller was one of them. And he realized all too late that he made a deal with the devil. And he had a lot of time to think about that in a concentration camp. And in those years, he thought about his complicity by not standing up against the National Socialist Party. And not long after his time, after the camp was liberated, he wrote this. This is a quote that some of you maybe have heard before, but it's very important to think about this. First, the Nazis, they came for the socialists, and I did not speak out because I was not a socialist. And then they came for the trade unionists, and I did not speak out because I was not a trade unionist. And then they came for the Jews, and I did not speak out because I was not a Jew. And then they came for me, and there was no one left to speak for me. Not speaking up to challenge bigotry always has consequences. Don't fool yourself into thinking otherwise. It always has consequences, as Niemöller discovered too late. It's the same point Dr. King made over and over in the civil rights movement. You think his harshest words were against the KKK? You should listen to his sermons and read his writings again. His harshest words were to white moderate to liberal Christians, who said, well, you have some pretty good things to say, but that's not really what the gospel's all about, It's about saving souls, and, plus you're disrupting law and order, and we don't like that, and that doesn't sell in our congregations. And King's letter to Birmingham has a lot to say about that, or his letter from Birmingham, I should say. Standing on the sidelines of history, standing flat-footed on the sidelines of history and doing nothing means you are complicit in injustice. And that's why King was pretty unpopular in his day, something we've often forgotten. Most polls, up until when King died, had a majority of white Americans with a disapproval of Dr. King. They did not like that message. We don't like to be told that we're complicit, but it's an important ethical message to consider in this case. Finally, why should we care about Islamophobia? Because it prevents us from being the nation we proclaim to be. It prevents us from being the nation we promise to be. We claim to be this land of the free. We claim to be the land of equality, but is that who we really are? Because there's a history of prejudice and bigotry in this country that contradicts those promises and those claims. And when I think about this point, I am reminded of the African-American poet and author Langston Hughes, who in 1936 wrote a poem that I love called Let America Be America Again. And in that poem, he points out the contradiction between America as an ideal and America as a lived reality, particularly for a black man. The promise and the reality. In the poem, he talks about all the peoples who have not experienced the America that others boast about. the poor, immigrants, Native Americans, and African Americans. All of them hear the promises, but they are not experiencing them. Which leads Hughes to make his most famous refrain in that poem. America never was America to me. Imagine a black man in 1936 telling white readers, America never was America to me. What I love about his poem, though, is that he still believes in that idea. He didn't give up on it. That's why he wrote the poem. He wants America to live up to its promises. He wants to hold it to the standards that it claims to hold itself by. But he says America can only do that by taking seriously the voices and experiences of those whom America has failed, and in some cases, whom America has failed abysmally. This sums up my feelings about Islamophobia as well. Many Muslims in the United States believe in America. That is my experience in working with Muslim communities. They actually have a very optimistic appraisal of this country and have benefited from it in many ways. And they believe in its promises. They want America to be America to them, just like America is America to me, just as Hughes wanted America to be America to him. But anti-Muslim bigotry works to rip them from the fabric of this nation. America never was America to me, Hughes said. And then he goes on to say, and yet I swear this oath, America will be. That's the phrase I carry with me in the work I do. It's the phrase I hope you carry with you in the work that you continue to do, the good work that you continue to do, as we work to overcome and to eliminate what is one of the most acceptable prejudices in the United States today. Thanks.
Thank you, Dr. Green. That was great. We have a lot of time for questions and answers.
Sure.
Okay. We'd like to get another microphone up here for the people giving. Do you have a way to do that, Peter? No. Okay. Well, we're gonna have to share the mic. Okay.
I'll try to repeat the question if you're having trouble hearing the questioner.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
All right.
I'll do my best.
Okay. Come on up and we'll form a line. So Mark, you have, and Mary.
Okay. Just ask a question.
Sure.
Thank you, Mark. Thank you very much, Todd.
Yeah.
Did you bring any of your copies of your wonderful book?
You know who else asked me that this morning in the car? My wife, about 5 miles from here. So the question is, did I bring copies of my book with me? And the answer is no, I did not. Okay, in retrospect.
Oh, because I forgot to remind you.
No, you're right. No, and my wife was a Tabita, bless her heart. Yeah. So Amazon has the copies of it, and Barnes and Noble, you can order it online. Fortress Press is also the name of the press, but so yeah, my apologies. I also should say my book came out about a year ago, but it came out in May, right before the presidential election cycle really kicked in. So sometimes I look at my book now and thinking it's already outdated. You know, it's only a year old, but there's no Donald Trump in there, for example. So you might have to read someone else's book for that. Okay. So yes.
I've been put in the position of moving into a complex for living with 60% Muslim people and about 30%, 40% others. And it's been such an experience, and one of the things that you said just hit me so hard is that it takes months to reach out to your neighbors, to trust you, and then you have to keep on trusting. And only this week, I finally invited one of the families over to lunch, but I started this last October, so
Oh, wow.
it was just connections every day, something for the kids or something at Christmas. And I think that it makes me glad to hear you say that, because I really feel what you're saying is so basic.
Thank you. Thank you. Did everyone hear that? Yeah. Well, I will not do justice, but she's been working at a home where 60% Muslim, and so trying to establish. Was that my fault? All right. About 60% Muslims, and so you have a Muslim population and non-Muslim population kind of building these relationships, which has to take years, right? And sort of reinforcing this point that relationships do really make a difference. But it sounds like you have been part of the hard work of building relationships, and I don't have a quick solution to Islamophobia, frankly, any bigotry. I think relationships are crucial to combating all forms of bigotry, but they are, I'm all for the interfaith lunches, trust me. I love interfaith lunches, or going to celebrate Eid, or Passover, or whatever, with a different religious community. But if you just show up once a year, that's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about what's really more of a commitment, and that does take years, like you have pointed out. So thank you for bearing witness to that. Yes, sir.
Yeah, this may be a dumb question, but let's try to do it. Anyway, I recently moved to Minnesota, another part of the country where we have a lot of Muslim people. I had many Muslim contacts in my business, and I believe...
Can you hear?
No.
Okay.
I'll raise the volume.
All right. Just hold it a little closer to your mouth, I think.
Does that work better?
Yeah. Okay, that's good. That's good.
Okay. I come from another part of the country where there's a lot of Muslim people, and I was able, through my business and personal contacts, to develop many relationships, and that is the key. But I haven't encountered many Islamic people since I've been here. What would make that easier? We all need to do that.
Right. So where do you live now? In Minnesota?
Red Wing.
You live in Red Wing, okay.
Yeah.
Well, no, it's a good question. I get this question asked in Decorah, where I live. Decorah is a small town in Iowa.
Right.
Yeah. Of course, at Luther College, we do have some Muslim students who are on campus, and that does give people opportunity. But the gist of the question, right, is if you live, wherever you live in a small town, live in a larger city, it's not like Muslims are just knocking on your door, all right? And that might be strange anyway. So how do you establish those relationships? And there are several things you can do. So if you have a college campus nearby, oftentimes a Muslim Student Association will be present, even if they're small, and they will host events in many cases, and that's one way to develop those connections. A second way, not ideal, but in the world of social media, which I have a love-hate relationship with, but you can virtually develop some relationships with people from all over the world, right? You don't have to physically be present with them. I don't think that is the ultimate solution, but it's a move down the road. But I can also tell you that in the case of Decorah, while we might have Muslim students on campus, we don't have a mosque or Islamic center or anything like that. So I do have to get them in a van sometimes and drive them where there is one. Now, I've taken the Rochester. There's several mosques I can recommend in Minnesota that are very good about welcoming visitors, and I can leave those suggestions with Bill. Maybe that can be put on the website somewhere where you can reach out and make that case. And I've had a group of church folks who arranged this from Decorah, who drove up and just had a field day, and they spent a day in visiting a couple mosques, also the Hindu temple in Minnesota, something they couldn't experience in Decorah. But the final thing I'll say is, and this might take a little research. I don't claim to know the Red Wing area well, but sometimes I'll get a similar question asked in Decorah, like, well, there are no Muslims around. And I'll say, you want to see Muslims, walk into Walmart on Saturday in Decorah, and you'll see plenty of Muslims. Because actually, from Minnesota, we have got a bit of a migration of Somali Muslims from Minnesota coming down now, and they're settling in Postville, where there's a significant Orthodox Jewish community as well. So Postville is just a 20-minute drive from Decorah. And a lot of people in Decorah just don't think there's religious diversity around, and I was like, you don't know your own backyard. Well, there actually is. But yeah, you have to sort of pay attention to that as well. So it will take more effort, but I do appreciate the challenge.
Thank you.
Thank you.
May I comment on that?
Sure.
Okay.
Follow up.
And it's very important to recognize that there are different types or different cultural or different economic stratas of Muslims. I live close to Woodbury that has a lot of Muslims, but they're very educated and sophisticated, and they're a whole lot different than where I live, which is in a housing project. I live in a project with a lot of Somalis, and it's totally different people. So you have to recognize that. I would imagine anyone going to Decorah is probably going to fit in the Woodbury area. So it's a little different. I just went to a Ramadan dinner, and we got to ask questions. But the standard white Christian people, we could ask questions, but we always ask safe questions. It's the same thing with this that's going on in the media right now. We only ask safe things that we're not going to offend or we really want to know. And I don't know how we're ever going to change that.
No, it's a fair point, particularly about the kinds of questions you ask when you're making friends, right? And people who do what I do, we have very different opinions. I mean, there's a lot of debate about, if you sit Christians and Muslims and Jews in a room and say, they don't know each other, and you say, well, what about Palestine? My experience, good luck. I don't think that's going to go very far. It's not going to facilitate deep conversations on that day, at least. I tend to prefer more organic relationships to evolve, and some of that can be done by doing common community service projects. I've known Muslims and Christians join together for Habitat for Humanity or establishing a common soup kitchen together, where they're doing work together that both is fed by their traditions. And then as they get to know each other that way, these other conversations can evolve, and eventually you get to the place where you can ask the trickier questions. But I confess it's difficult to walk into a mosque, and I don't know if I'd even recommend that the first question out of your mouth is about Israel-Palestine. Some would disagree with me. But I don't. My experience, that just doesn't go very far. When there's no trust there's no relationship. Yeah. Yes.
When you described what terrorism feeds on and ISIS wants, isn't that basically why, I'll use our country because I can't speak for other countries, but our country as a whole has been basically going down the drain before even the problem of Muslims and that came about? Isn't that why any gang, angry groups of people get together, whether it's Black, Native American, low income, or whatever? They've been demonized by the media and the government of it's their fault, they're bad people, they're takers, they're moochers, they're, and they don't feel anyone is on their side to help them or build or support them. Right.
Yeah, boy, I have a lot of thoughts about terrorism. A couple of things that come to mind there. One is, in terms of what motivates terrorism, there is a political scientist named Robert Pape who has been tracking, he tracks suicide terrorist bombings in particular. So, which is not every terrorist attack, but people who intentionally intend to blow themselves up or have themselves killed in the process of killing others. And for a number of decades now, he has tracked every suicide terrorist bombing he can find, try to find out what the motive of driving it is. Oftentimes, particularly if it's intentional, the perpetrator has left some sort of signs or explicitly stated why they're doing it. And his conclusion is 95% of these suicide terrorist bombings are driven by political reasons. He's not saying religion is absent, but he is saying in particular it tends to be driven by the perception of occupation. Either military occupation of your own country, or the military occupation of another country that you might, for some reason, identify with. Palestine kind of comes to mind in some cases in that regards, right? But it's this idea that there's this other foreign power, right? And he's not just talking about Muslims. So you brought up England. When the London bombings in 2005 took place, even though we're already in a post-9/11 world, certainly there was quick speculation about Muslims, but I remember the media coverage in Britain at the time also was very quickly speculating about other groups, because if you're from England and you grew up in the 70s and 80s and you think about terrorist attacks in London, you don't think Muslims. Who do you think? Right. And that's sort of Pape's point, right? There's another example of perceived, foreign encroachment or occupation or whatever. In that case, a very complicated history goes back centuries. So that's one thing to keep in mind with this. And another thing is that you're talking oftentimes about a lot of people people who are disenfranchised, who don't have access to the apparatus of the military or the state, right? Though we can talk about state-sponsored terrorism, and we tend to do that with countries like Iran, we can broaden that conversation for other countries too. The final thing I'll say about that I don't know. I'm processing this idea, so bear with me. You're just a test audience in this case. But I have increasingly come to the conclusion that terrorism has become a fairly meaningless word. Who it gets applied to, who it does not get applied to. It's very racialized, it's very religionized, if you will. Certainly Omar Mateen, automatically he was categorized as terrorist, right? And we had this debate over whether other things were driving him. Was he closetly gay? Was he, as it says, homophobic? It's just a hate crime. But the media and politicians liberally threw around the word terrorism, right? Contrast that with Dylan Roof the summer before. I couldn't pay a journalist to use the T word for Dylan Roof. I have no idea why we cannot call Dylan Roof and his attack on the church in Charleston and killing of African American church members after a Bible study, why that's not terrorism. And if we can't call that terrorism, then and other similar examples, Norway, Anders Breivik in Norway, 2011. Again, as soon as it was discovered that this was not a Muslim, but someone who looks a little bit like me, just taller and Scandinavian, as soon as it was discovered who it was, immediately the journalists just dropped the terrorist word. And now we're talking about a right-wing extremist. We're talking about someone who has mental health issues and struggles, but you could not venture the T word out there. And if we can't do that, then defining terrorism has become almost impossible. Unless we're just going to be honest about it in government circles and many media circles and say, oh, you mean people who are Arab or Muslim. Just, if that's what you mean, just say it. Then I'll fight you on it, but at least you're being honest. Because I think there's a lot of dishonest discourse right now over how we deal with violence and who perpetrates it and how we categorize them that drive some unsavory political motives, and we shouldn't be naive about that, I think. Yes, sir, it is the mic. Okay, all right, here, I'm sorry, up in front.
John, name your book, and give me your website, and we'll put on the no flyers.
Okay. Book is called The Fear of Islam. That's the main title. An Introduction to Islamophobia in the West. The good news is that the website is not a big departure. The website's called thefearofislam.com. Through which you can order the book. So, yes.
Okay, this isn't a question, but more of a comment. Here in Minnesota, what we do for a way of hospitality that I've noticed in the Twin Cities towards our Muslim neighbors is that a lot of people have been putting up lawns. I'm sorry.
That's all right. Speak up.
Have been putting up lawn signs saying bless our Muslim neighbors. And I noticed that when we, when I saw one first on the lawn of the Freedom Library over on the east side of St. Paul, and I brought one home into my room, into my private room, since I live in an apartment, and I think that, and some of the progressive churches have them, and I think that's just wonderful. And we also have a real progressive state, progressive congressperson who is black and a Muslim by the name of Keith Ellison. You probably heard him.
Yeah, I actually interviewed Keith Ellison in my book. The last chapter, I interviewed a number of prominent Muslims, and Ellison was very gracious to grant me time. And if you have a really jaded, negative view of politicians and think that they're intellectually disengaged, you should have a conversation with Keith Ellison, and you will change your mind. Yeah.
signs are something to look at.
Right. No, the talking about yard signs, particularly have a blessed Ramadan and that sort of thing. I think those are great ways to sort of show your support for your Muslim neighbors.
Yeah, please next.
Okay, what I wanted to talk about is why is anti-Semitic used mostly by the state of Israel and a lot of Jewish people to mean anti-Semitic when Palestinians, Yemenis, Iraqis, Syrians, and other Arabs are all Semitic people.
It's a good. I don't have a great answer for you, but the question was about literally the word anti-Semitism doesn't seem to fit its actual application, because we talk about anti-Semitism in the context of opposition or hostility to Jews, but there are plenty of people of a Semitic background who aren't Jewish. They could be Christian or Muslim or otherwise. The short answer is that language is malleable. I get a similar question on Islamophobia. Is that the best word for what I'm talking about? And the academic in me is like, yeah, we can quibble with that word. It's not perfect. Is this about religion? Is it about race? Is Islamophobia a form of racism? Is it a similar kind of racism than anti-black racism? Those are all valid questions, and whether that word Islamophobia captures all that or whether it misses some things. But the word Islamophobia has developed, actually in the modern discourse came from Britain in the late 90s, but it has sort of developed to kind of be the term we use for Muslims and anti-Muslim hostility, even as the academic in me notes its limitations. And I would say the same thing about anti-Semitism. It has really come to be used to talk about opposition or hostility to the Jews, but if you actually think about the literal meaning of the word, it clearly is missing something as well. But that's, language does evolve, and that's kind of how I process the jargon issue, at least. Yes.
As a mother of a black son who is 36 and as a member of Black Lives Matter, I was terrified by the fact that the head of the union of police in Minneapolis called Black Lives Matter a terrorist organization. That word used.
Yeah, so the head of the union, the police union in Minneapolis, referred to the Black Lives Matter movement as terrorist, as an example of this language, right? Yeah, and the connection with perceiving most terrorists to be Muslims, at least, is still the racialized component of it, I think, right? And that is a problem. No one's probably going to listen to me when I say maybe we should just excise the word terrorism from our vocabulary for a while, until we can find a legitimate sort of use for it. But that is a good example of its uneven application.
How did you expand on that thing? You talk about what is terrorism, right? I studied the issues of imperialism from the perspective of nation building.
Right.
Assimilation, creating a unified culture. I get this message all the time now after Orlando, of course. We're all one. We all have to be one. But the reality is we're all many, and we have to learn to recognize our differences and cooperate with that. But I think of things like, the witch trials in the 1600s, McCarthyism, the domino theory that supported Vietnam, the Cold War mentality, and now terrorism. Isn't it essentially defined as a method of imperialistic control? Short summary of that is terrorism basically an extension of or a method of imperial control, right? Or the labeling of it, the discourse. I think that's a very plausible argument to make, right? Yeah, you're right. I have not used that exact language, but I guess I'm sort of been dancing around the very thing, I've said it in certain ways.
Yeah, who gets to say it, who gets to use it, who gets to define it, who it gets applied to, who it does not get applied to, and what sort of work does that word do, right? How does it sort of inspire or serve as a catalyst for people to rally behind war, rally behind certain domestic policies, surveillance policies? I think about the surveillance state we're in now, and who we conduct surveillance on and why, and suspected terrorists. And after Orlando, this idea of the Democrats, bless them, they were really trying, I think, and to an extent, but they got on the floor for this sort of big rally, right, and sort of grounding things to a halt about this no-fly, maybe the people we shouldn't sell guns to are people suspected of being terrorists on some sort of government watch list. And I thought, no, that's exactly the problem, right? Once you start to employ that language and that tool of terrorists, and I suspect you, I'm in the government somewhere and with power, and I suspect you of being a terrorist, then, the hell with your civil rights and liberties and constitutional rights, the hell with due process. I mean, that's not all that important anyway, right? As long as you are a suspected terrorist. In my case, with the government is, if they suspect you of terrorism, they need to make that case, and they need to make that case in court. And if they cannot make that case, then there's nothing they can do. And until they make that case, they cannot infringe upon your constitutional rights. But yet all these government watch lists do exactly that, and they use the mantle of terrorism, which is about power. And I do think it's about control and rallying troops to the cause. All right?
Yeah. Oh, I'm saying that you are so right on that it's just staggering to me, and I've never staggered before. But what I was going to...
That's on tape, right? Okay.
The thing that I've noticed, I work in a daycare of the children of the people who are learning English in my community. We're teaching English to the adults, and I do the daycare with a lot of other help. And the children wear shiba, how do you say that word? It's all a veil to me, of course. The veil, sort of. And if you really want to get to know the Muslim culture and how beautiful they are, is to go through the children. The children in the daycare, there are many Muslim children, and the little ones are so gorgeous and lovely and beautiful children. And there we are so equal. We are so equal. Children are children, whether they're whatever they wear, and the mothers, for the most part, are bringing the children. So it's you're right on about, I think, the interpersonal relationships. The real answer to getting over Islamophobia. It might even be the first impediment to not have relationships. That's probably bigger than imperialism. No relationships, you could care less about them.
Right.
But the children will go through the children because they are outstandingly, magnificently beautiful.
Oh, well said, well said.
Hi. So I'm just wondering. I'm just wondering, I guess in a sense I was thinking about what you were saying about forming relationships, and I was just wondering, couldn't the way it's taken and applied be consequential in the sense that like kind of, if you don't think about it in the right way and you think of it, I have to make friends with someone that's a Muslim, then they're gonna, in a kind of imperialistic way, go in and, make friends with this person and then say, okay, I've done that,
I have my Muslim friend now, yeah.
Yeah, and kind of it's just like, it's just kind of like a cover, I guess, in a way, for a real issue, and I feel like, in a way, it kind of just perpetuates, like, this idea of, the white people going in and kind of, making things better for the... Right. So, yeah.
No, if I'll summarize that the best I can, the gist of it is there a danger of, in establishing relationships, in this case with Muslims, where you still have this sort of imperialistic mentality or this idea that, here comes the white person, the savior, the Messiah comes in, going to make some Muslim friends, and that also can be easily abusive, right? And I think that's a very good point. It's one thing to say that relationships make the difference and move the needle. I still believe that. I think there's a lot of data to support that. There's a very good social scientific theory behind that even. It's another thing to talk about how that happens and what context that happens. And there are no easy answers on this. Because I don't believe really there's any such thing as neutral space for these relationships to emerge. We all have to be very conscientious of how this takes place, where it takes place, who's driving the conversation, who's driving these events. A lot of churches I have spoken with or engaged with, they're very interested in doing this stuff, but more interfaith work, right? But a lot of what they have to learn to do is let go a bit of controlling it. And being patient with whoever it is, and not just Muslims, this could be any other religious community, when it comes to how the pace of the relationship, how it unfolds, the circumstances. Honestly, there are some Muslim communities that will be suspicious of people like me wanting to come in and say, hey, can I come observe you on Friday prayers? I mean, the average Lutheran doesn't have to have their worship service observed, right? I mean, if you are Lutheran and you go to a Lutheran church in Iowa or Minnesota, you don't have tourists come into the sanctuary standing along the corners watching you pray or sing. That's a very different dynamic from Muslims when you go visit and say, I want to see you and you practice your faith, right? And you need to be aware of that. So these relationships can be abused and instrumentalized. And philosophically, without going into, take a long time to go into maybe a lot of strategies, but philosophically, the mindset, I think, for people in the majority population is not to be the one in charge. In Christian theology, there's a movement called liberation theology, Latin American liberation theology. That's what it's all about. It's about liberation and challenging oppressive systems and structures from below, from the grassroots, and from those who suffer their consequences the most, and they take the lead. And it's not the middle class or the wealthy person with a guilty liberal conscience who comes in and takes the lead. They follow, and they learn, and they allow others who are suffering these consequences to be the ones not only to teach them, but to set the terms and the pace by which that happens. And I hope that helps a little bit, at least philosophically, with how best to avoid that. It takes letting go, but when you're in the majority population, and particularly if you're white or Christian, you're not used to being in that position of letting someone else take charge, and that's why it's easy to say that, much harder to carry out. That's why I tell my students all the time, I know interfaith work sounds great. My experience is it's really hard, and it's really messy, really difficult, and can get tense sometimes. That's why you have to have a long-term commitment to it as well. Years, not a couple of Starbucks trips so that you have a token Muslim friend. Not what I'm talking about.
Yeah. Okay, okay. I wanted to add to the consequences of Islamophobia is the codification of Islamophobia through the U.S. federal courts. We've seen this in entrapment trials of Muslim youth, and also some women from Rochester, Minnesota, who were given the maximum sentences. Yeah. They're in prison for decades now. And these youth recently have been. So court watch could be something that people can do. There are three youths that haven't, at least three youths, the three who went on trial recently, who were sentenced by an all-white jury. I've seen another sentencing, all-white jury, and in Minneapolis, in the U.S. federal court there. So I think it's really important to do that, to have court watch or rally outside the courtroom sentencing. This is a way we can come into the Muslim community too. We're asking support from all-white people, as the African American movement did at one time. Encourage people to come. So I just want to put, there's a fundraiser tonight for the Somali family, tomorrow night, Sunday night, for the Somali families. Supporting those families is really important.
No, thank you. I ran through a quick list of consequences, but when you dig into the details, that's a good example, right, of a system going awry. Maybe it's always been awry, I don't know. I do write, I think Mike German, who'll be talking later today, has a lot more insight on this. In my book, I do write a little bit about some of the FBI entrapment. I used the case of the Newburgh Four, and some of you may have heard that story, but it's a great example, kind of a classic the model of entrapment. Really, the FBI using informants, creating a terrorist scenario, creating a false terrorist plot, then trying to lure people into it, usually with some significant manipulation, sometimes in money, and then you create a terrorist plot that actually doesn't exist. you entrap people in it who actually might have other motivations for eventually joining it, then of course you arrest them and you prosecute, and you can then herald this victory in the war on terror. But when the Newburgh Four, and I remember the judge, after that conviction, she took the government to task on that, saying you've basically done nothing. You haven't solved a terrorist plot. It didn't exist until the government created it, and only to entrap people. And that's a significant problem. And I know there is a debate over whether that's entrapment or not. I tend to think that it is. I think there are human rights organizations that are very concerned about that process. But if to win the domestic war on terror, all that in quotes, you have to create and concoct a terrorist plot that doesn't exist to do it. Something is really, really messed up. There's a word for that, and there's a vulgar word for that I can think of about what's going on. But we should be really upset about that. That's not how our system should work.
Okay, I have just two quick questions. One is, when we talk about Islamophobia, it feels like we're primarily talking about in the US or maybe some European countries. Is it more worldwide, or can you address that?
Yeah.
And wait, I have one more.
Sure, absolutely.
Then terrorism. I would really like to have a definition for that, and maybe just your definition would be be a good start. But I have been thinking for years that drone warfare is just a prime example of terrorism. When you have I heard a speaker who had drones flying over his village, a small village, flying around and around, and just seeing and hearing those drones. What could be more terrorizing? And that's when we were bombing from drones on a quite frequent basis. End of question.
Okay, so I'll start with the second and then remember the first. So part of the people who kind of do what I do, I mean, one of the things we get frustrated about is there isn't really a consistent definition of terrorism, even in official circles. But if you were trying to find a common denominator definition, and this is my best shot at this in terms of the FBI or others, it would be violent attacks targeting non-combatants or civilians, usually to affect political change in some way. I mean, that's a very generic definition. Of course, if that's the case, you go back to, well, would drone strikes count? And it's easy to make the case that it could with that generic definition, unless you're going to rule out state actors, or rule out state actors that are part of the United States and its coalitions. So that's why even that definition doesn't really help, because then it's not applied. That's why people are frustrated. No matter what kind of definition you put out there, it goes back to even the Dylann Roof, right? Well, he was trying to affect a social or political change. It was a horrible one when he opened fire in Charleston in that church, but he wasn't just doing it just to get media attention. There was an ideology there too. So that's why it's like, well, that should be terrorism. As for, is Islamophobia just something primarily in the U.S. or is it global or other parts of the world? I would argue, I think the U.S. is catching up with Europe, but I would argue that Islamophobia may be worse in Europe. And there are a variety of reasons why that is. European laws sort of manage religious liberty a little bit differently than the United States. So in France, in public schools in France, girls can't wear the hijab. And now much public space in France, you can't wear a burqa or a niqab, which is much more, covers much more. That's generally true in Belgium as well. Switzerland, as I mentioned earlier, in 2009, they banned the construction of minarets, which are the prayer towers usually attached to mosques. Oftentimes in Europe, they're ornamental. You don't even hear the call to prayer from them. But Switzerland had 4 up until 2009. 2009, and the nativist populist party that was in charge, the Swiss People's Party, thought it was 4 too many and it was a danger, and so they led a referendum and it passed. But that would be difficult to pass something like that in the United States. I'll never say impossible. I don't believe, as a historian, I just don't rule anything out, but it'd be difficult. First Amendment wouldn't, in the way it's interpreted, wouldn't make things like that difficult. So Muslims in Europe do have to encounter those kinds of things in a different way. Muslims in Europe also tend to be much further down the socioeconomic ladder. The kinds of discrimination they experience, particularly in the worst places, is probably more severe. And part of that comes from the history of modern migration and immigration in Europe. A lot of this is post-World War II, guest worker programs, blue-collar laborers, unskilled laborers coming in, invited by European governments. They weren't knocking down the door or anything. They were invited to come in to help rebuild the infrastructure and the economies of these countries. And that's how Muslims, in a significant way, started to come into Europe in terms of the population. But the backgrounds of many Muslims, they tend to be less educated and less well off financially than the non-Muslim population in Europe. And in the United States, it's the exact opposite. Muslims tend to be middle class or higher. They tend to be as educated, if not better educated, than the non-Muslim majority population. And in some cases, more educated. One thing I have to feel sometimes about education in Muslim women, and doesn't Islam teach that you're not supposed to educate women? And I try to complicate that narrative by reminding them that 43% of Muslim women in the United States have a college degree or higher, compared to 29% of women in the overall population. And that includes Catholic and Protestant women. So if I'm concerned about women of a certain religious community not getting enough access to higher education, I wouldn't first go to Muslims. I would go to Catholics and Protestants because they're lower. Now, that's not true across everywhere in the world. I'm just saying that it's complicated, right? But that also says something about the demographics of Muslims in the United States. It doesn't mean they don't experience Islamophobia. You can be a victim of a hate crime no matter what your socioeconomic status. You can be targeted for surveillance, no-fly list, you name it, no matter what your socioeconomic status. It's simply that Muslims are in a different place. And that's why Muslims in the United States tend to have a more optimistic appraisal of their future than when Muslims are asked that kind of question in polling in Europe, where they tend to be much more pessimistic about their future. It goes back to that Langston Hughes poem, right? They recognize the discrepancy, but they do have this. They have this belief in the ideal of America, this land of equality, and they have experienced some of that economically, at least.
Last question.
Last question. This will be great.
It's not a question, it's a story.
A story. All right.
It's a personal story about my doctor. I went to the doctor recently, and she is, I assumed she was Muslim. Mm-hmm. Well, we started talking. We got through the professional stuff, and she said that her mother had recently passed away. And she said they had a Muslim funeral. So I was very interested in this funeral because I had just gone to a green cemetery with one of my sisters. Well, she went on to explain everything about this Muslim funeral and how they washed the body and that they had a special mosque at the cemetery and they had their own space. And it was so very, very interesting to me. So she asked me about our funerals, and I told her about the embalming, and I have to sit down, I'm very nervous.
It's okay.
And after we were all done, I felt so close to her, because we went out of the professional realm and we went into the personal realm. And she educated me, and she said to me, "Thank you for educating me about your funerals." And I got up and I said, "Can I give you a hug?" And she said, "Of course." And we hugged each other, and it was awesome.
Oh, what a story. What a story.
But we probably will never be personal friends, but I love her dearly. I mean, I just feel like I got so close to this person.
It's a good way to end, I think, because it reminds me of maybe three very quick points I can make that actually aren't mine. I'm just plagiarizing this from a theologian named Christopher Stendahl, who did a lot of interfaith work before he died, and sort of had three principles of interfaith work, and what you talked about reminds me of one of them. One of them is called holy envy. holy envy, which is this idea that one way to connect and develop a relationship with someone of a different religious tradition is to explore with that person their own tradition and their own words, right, and their own experiences. And in the process, you develop a sense of holy envy, envying something in their tradition that maybe makes you then come back to your own tradition and find something or get excited about something that's been there, or see it in a different light than you saw it before you had that experience, right? So if you're thinking about this larger context of building bridges across religions and cultures and whatnot, I like that idea of holy envy, being curious about someone else's religion in a way that you will almost always learn more about your own in the end. The second thing he talks about is when engaging in interfaith work, you don't learn from the enemies of that religion, learn from their practitioners, right? So when we learn about Islam, just to take the example, far too often the people we see in the media are not Muslims, and they're not friends of Muslims. In some cases, they're the enemies of Muslims. And I can't imagine many Lutherans or Presbyterians or Catholics putting up with that, right? That, oh, you want to learn about Catholicism, go listen to that anti-Catholic person. I'm sure he'll tell you everything you need to know. That's not how we do interfaith work, right? You learn from the people who practice it, not from the people who hate it, right? Yeah, go ahead.
I have one more story from Don.
Oh, sure.
But how old is you too?
Oh, okay, it's very brief. I just want to give some examples. We've talked about adults. Many of us are parents, and others need to realize that we need to deal with this. When my wife and I were in one case, the restaurant had black and white tables. My wife and I left, and my children, my daughters, they got up and picked up their plates and put them over with the blacks. The same thing happened at a swimming pool, where in this community, they pulled out all the whites. Our daughters went in and swam with all the blacks. We have need of thinking not just ourselves, but the children who will be in the next one. I'm a retired professor, and I won't give you a 70-minute lecture, but I'm now in the process of writing my chapter on my experience in living with people of different cultures.
Oh, very, very good, I think. It goes back to that earlier point about children and how important it is, I think, to cultivate those relationships early on. And we know this from social scientific studies too, that the older you get, the harder it is to sort of unlearn things. And that's prejudices. It's also just a lot of things. It's harder to learn how to ride a bicycle in your 40s than when you're 9. And that's just a fact. Harder to learn foreign languages as you get older than when you're younger. And so, but that's also true about, I think, intercultural, interfaith relationships as well. And children are good for that. This is one of the things I like about teaching college, and I don't think of college students as children at all. I try to remind them they're adults. But I do certainly have experience in working and combating Islamophobia publicly that the difficult audiences oftentimes are not college students. They have questions, but they generally get it. It's people my age and older. That's where I run into the problems. And part of it's because a number of my students have had relationships already with Muslims. They went to school in the cities or in Chicago or whatever, and this is just not that big of a deal. And those are relationships that are also developed organically in other contexts. They weren't sort of enforced upon them. And we need to think about that as well, in terms of the hope that a younger generation has, and also what they have to teach us, which for many of us might be difficult because we are older, right? Anyway, well, thank you for all this. Thank you for this opportunity. Yeah.
Todd?
Thank you, Bill. I appreciate that.